Right. Well, welcome everybody. Great to see so many of you here and so many familiar names. We've had a lot of sign-ups today, so I'm sure more people will trickle in. But yes, hello and welcome, and thanks very much for joining this AFN Network Plus webinar, where we're going to be digging into AFN's newly published report out just last week called Roadmap for Resilience, a UK Food Plan for 2050. So I'm Jess Fredenberg and I'm going to be your chair today. I'm based at the School of Environmental Sciences at the University of East Anglia, where I'm the Knowledge Exchange Fellow for the AFN Network Plus. If you don't know us, you don't know what AFN is, well, what is it? It's a UKRI funded project with 3,000 members now across the UK, all focused on this big question of how to transition the UK food system to one that is healthier, more resilient, just and sustainable. So this big question of how to do that has occupied us for the last 2.5 years or so. And the report we're going to be looking at today is the culmination of that. It's been influenced in many different ways by, I'd say, probably hundreds of people, many of whom are probably on this call and who are part of the AFN network via multiple different activities that we run over the last couple of years, things like our big tent sort of annual conference and things like that. It's also had 150 people contribute sort of directly to the report. So it's a really big collective effort. So if you've been part of that in some way, thank you very much. So to share the findings and implications with everyone today, we've got our speakers. Both of them are co-leads of AFN and report authors. They are Professor Tim Benton from the University of Leeds and Professor Neil Ward from the University of East Anglia. So also with us is our project manager, John Haslam, and John will keep everything running smoothly in the background and will step in if my internet goes. If you've got any technical issues as we go along, please message John in the chat. Look out for links that he'll be sharing of the roadmap if he hasn't done so already. What we're going to do is we're going to have a short presentation from Tim. Tim will set the scene for us with the big picture and the context for all of this, followed by Neil, who will present more on the detail of the key findings and where we go from there. Then we're going to be exploring a big question around how we make this actually happen, how we make the roadmap happen politically. And we'll also be taking questions from all of you guys as the audience. So we'll probably have about 30 minutes for that sort of discussion time. So if you've got questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A box so they're easy for me to find. Save the chat for comments, discussion, sharing of links. And also, we're really keen to hear from you if you've got any ideas about how we make the roadmap happen and how we sort of break this political deadlock, how we make that happen. So please put that in the chat also, and I might be able to read out some of those. So yeah, I'd also ask, please, if you could, when posing questions, please could you try to keep them sort of beneficial for everybody. So if you've got, very specific queries about a data set or figures, parameters for the modeling, all that kind of thing, we're really happy to answer those questions, but please email them to us so we can just focus on having a really good discussion. So Tim is going to speak. Let me introduce Tim a little bit more. So Tim is a long-standing researcher in sustainable agriculture and food systems and led the UK's Global Food Security Programme from 2011 to 2016. Tim was also Chatham House's Research Director for Emerging Risks and Director of its Environment and Society Programme up until very recently. So I always enjoy Tim's presentations. I know lots of other people do too. So Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Jez. Hello, everybody. I don't want to go on for too long because Neil's got the kind of the meat of the new stuff that we've done. But there has been a host of work reports and papers over the last decade or so that has really highlighted how much the food system externalizes issues outside the production of food onto the environment and onto human health, particularly. We know, for example, in the UK, the food system is responsible for about 38% of emissions and will soon if it's not already, be the biggest emitting sector. That 38% includes the overseas footprint of food. If we don't tackle climate emissions, if we don't tackle climate change in the way that we need to, the impact of climate will just get more disruptive as years go on. So in a sense, we've got to, looking ahead, we've got to tackle the issue of climate change through adaptation, but also importantly, mitigation. We know poor diets cost the UK as much as 268 billion a year. From direct and indirect causes, social support, lost productivity, and the direct cost of healthcare. And about 2/3 of UK adults are obese. And over the last 5 years, post-COVID, post-Ukraine, post-Brexit, we also increasingly have the evidence that our food system is fragile and subject to supply chain disruptions, and we can all share those experiences of going into supermarkets and finding shelves bare from our recent history. So that's today's food system, and our food system is not really working in the way that we want to. But looking ahead, the world in which that food system is embedded, the geopolitical, the political, and the market drivers are likely to change enormously. You know, if you'd gone back to 2015 and looked forward a decade, the world we live in today would not have been, if you'd predicted it, people would have said, no, you're making things up. It's never going to happen. We live in a world where we've got a real proxy, hybrid, and trade wars. We have undermining of the kind of multilateral rules-based architecture of cooperation, countries increasingly going for their own good, undermining cooperation in the name of kind of competitive edge. We have widespread backtracking on climate commitments. 10 years ago, when the Paris Agreement was signed, we all thought the job was kind of, in a sense, done, and we'd agreed that we'll tackle it. But now we're passing through the 1.5 degree barrier. Emissions are still rising, and problems are getting stacked up into the future. So if you take what we've experienced over the last 5 to 10 years and track it forward with Trump, with the rise of the polarized politics, with increasing conflict, with increasing climate disruption, we are going to be in a world that's ever more disrupted, contested, and conflicted. And of course, this is going to change a whole range of the market drivers and the political drivers. But one that becomes more important in a contested and conflicted and volatile world is that we have to worry more about where our food comes from and the degree to which we can rely on our food supply. So food security as part of national security is likely to become an ever-increasing driver of the politics and the regulatory framework for what we're doing. And of course, as I mentioned, as climate change bites and our weather patterns change and the extremes get more extreme and more frequent, adaptation will have to happen. Otherwise, our local farming and the farming that we rely on overseas will not be able to produce what we need it to when we need it. So in sum, change is necessarily coming. Every sector will have to change, and that change is likely to have to be rapid and deep because the globalized, calm, cooperative, stable world in which we have lived and in which the current food system has evolved doesn't exist, and will increasingly, that will be a memory. So as volatility mounts, business as usual as we are used to will necessarily have to change. It is not tenable for it to stay the same. So looking ahead, we know markets will change, particularly the market drivers associated with trade and where our food comes from. What is profitable or what has been profitable to produce in the UK won't necessarily be so profitable to produce in future, and what we might need in future might not be what we have typically produced in the UK. And so incentives, financial market and regulatory incentives are likely to change. As I said, national security is likely to become an increasing change driver, and that might change the subsidy regime as we go ahead. And net zero as a goal, i.e. Mitigating the emissions from land use, cannot be wished away as a too expensive, because unless we get to tackle our emissions in the long run, we just make the world more volatile, more difficult to cope with, and much more tricky in general. And so what we've done in this report is effectively we started with that context. And what we've wanted to do is think about how we drive things forward in a way that makes our food system better in terms of tackling the big challenges of human health through nutrition, biodiversity loss, pollution, land use, emissions, and food security. We want to tackle those challenges, but to tackle them and produce a kind of pathway to get to a transformed food system, you have to think about how things will evolve in terms of the drivers of the food system over the years. And what we did through the roadmap process, we're not going to talk about it in detail today, is we sampled alternative futures using a participatory scenarios approach. And then Sarah Bridle and her team built a big land use emissions calculator, and we put the scenarios through the calculator to work out, if we did this, and if we did this, and if we did this, what would happen to our emissions, what would happen to our land use, what would happen to our food security, what would happen to our self-sufficiency, and so on. So the roadmap report conclusions is effectively built on not betting on the future in terms of business as usual, which most people and most reports have done in the past, and assuming that the market drivers will stay the same and the political drivers will stay the same. What we've done is we've sampled different futures, and we've come up with a set of things that need to be done that are robust to the future uncertainty. Without predicting what the future will be, there are a number of things that you can only meet net zero if you do, whatever the future. And that forms the kind of backbone of our report. So that's enough context for me. I'm going to shut up and pass over to Neil now.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tim. I'm just going to introduce Neil while I think John's going to get his slides ready. But thanks, Tim, for that introduction. It was really great context setting. So Neil is a professor of rural and regional development at the University of East Anglia, where he was the Deputy Vice-Chancellor for a few years. He's also served as a Cabinet Office advisor on agricultural policy and is author of Net Zero Food and Farming, Climate Change and the UK Agri-Food System. So Neil, when you're ready with your slides, I don't know if John, have you got, I can't see the slides yet. Are you able to share them? Ah, brilliant. Thank you. Okay, Neil, over to you.
That's great. Thanks, John. You can probably move it on to the next one from there. So as Tim said, we use the scenarios to sort of take samples of possible plausible futures. So the scenarios that we developed, which we did do a webinar on some time ago, they're not options to pick from, but they're just tools to sort of stretch thinking beyond just a business as usual approach. And the modeling quantified those scenarios, and we were able to play around with trade-offs, looking at what is produced, where it's produced, trade, emissions, and we could control for not compromising the UK's food security, but getting to a net zero UK through change in the agri-food system. And what the modelling showed was that even if you have quite a diverse set of possible scenarios around the way that society and economy is organised and the way that the food system works, there was some common sort of unavoidable issues that were common across all scenarios. And so that provided the starting point for thinking about the roadmap. And the roadmap does suggest we need transformational change. So often we talk about a net zero transition, but we wanted to sort of raise the bar a bit and think about transformational change. So this is changing the fundamentals of the way that the system is organized and operates. So why did we think we need transformational change. But the first reason is the point that Tim made, that the system's going to change anyway. I mean, primarily as a result of the impacts of climate change, but also through increasingly unstable international geopolitics. So the question becomes not whether we're going to strive. The question becomes not whether we're going to change, but whether, as a society, we're going to try and manage that and manage it in a way that optimizes public benefits, or whether we're going to cling to the idea of just trying to maintain as near as possible to the status quo and yet get continually buffeted by events and ever-mounting pressures. So we take the view that the system's going to change anyway, and the quest becomes to navigate and manage that change optimally. Secondly, the farming system in particular is going to change. We hear a lot of discussion about low carbon technologies. When thinking about mitigation and net zero, the conversation quickly moves to adopting low carbon technologies, whether it be improved animal breeding, methane suppressing feed additives, or drones and robots and satellites and so on. Our modelling and our analysis suggests that yes, we need to adopt all of the low carbon technologies that are currently being talked about and thought about, but that, while necessary, is not sufficient, and that doesn't get us to where we need to be. We're going to have to think much more about how our farming changes in terms of what is produced and what is consumed, in addition to just the technologies and farming practices that are deployed in agriculture. Thirdly, it comes through quite clearly from the quantitative analysis that our land use will have to change to accommodate these pressures. This is going to mean using land more efficiently in terms of how it matches our needs, both our dietary needs and public health needs, but also the resilience of our agriculture and land use to climate change and to the challenges of net emissions reduction. The fourth reason is around diet change, which is a problem at the moment. Tim's talked about it. We've got about 2.8 million people permanently out of work due to ill health, and much of that ill health is diet related, and this is bringing financial pressures on how the NHS works and bringing pressures on its budgets. But more broadly than that, it is a drag on the productivity of UK PLC, with such a significant proportion of the potential workforce out of action, and so that undermines our national economic growth. So in these transformations, we have to move to a position where the UK population on aggregate is consuming a healthier diet. And the final message that comes through from the analysis is that the changes that the roadmap advocates are going to have to be thought about and managed together. You can't really untangle them and just pick the ones that you might feel are politically more straightforward, easier. They come as an intractable tangle or bundle and have to be looked at and thought about together. Next slide, please, John. So we see this as a historic opportunity that needs to be seized to redirect and transform the food system, particularly to make it more robust to navigate the changing world that we're in. We've got three core transformations that we're going to talk about that are at the heart of the roadmap, and if pursued together, they would bring a set of wider benefits as well. So they would save a lot of money in terms of healthcare costs over the medium and longer term. They would strengthen national resilience, both in the food system, but just the resilience of life in the UK. They would provide for healthier food for the UK population, and then there would be a set of additional benefits as well, likely to see reduced negative pressures on the water environment and river water quality, reduced pressures which are damaging biodiversity, and there's a potential here to build new economic activities that lead to a new green rural economy. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk about these three transformations in a bit more detail. And I think we can go on to the next one, which will be stronger, more resilient farming, the first of the three. So by strength and resilience here, we mean resilient businesses that also ensure the food system operates within environmental limits, with production well matched to UK consumption needs and public health objectives, whilst not undermining the UK's food security and ideally enhancing the UK's food security. So when we started out on the AFN project, when we wrote our proposal, we submitted it in February 2022, about 6 days before the tanks rolled into Ukraine. Our central focus was on achieving net zero. It's the Agri-Food for Net Zero Network Plus. But the journey that we've been on takes us to thinking about resilience much more broadly on a range of fronts. Agriculture is going to face significant change whether we had a net zero target or not. So if we look at the change on a broad front and prepare for it, then actually the roadmap takes us to a place where we resolve a set of issues and also deal with the net zero one. But it doesn't necessarily have to be starting with and framed by the net zero target. About 85% of our agricultural land in the UK supports animal production in one way or another, either the pasture land directly or the 40% of our arable land that is producing animal feeds. And this large proportion is hampering our ability to build resilience and strengthen food security. Animals are going to continue to be a really important part of UK agriculture through to 2050. They're going to be an important part of our farming systems. But two desirable trends would be a rebalancing that reduces that total land take, that 85% figure, and brings it down. And also that more geographically mixes livestock and arable agriculture together, particularly in the arable east. This would improve the circularity of resource use and help reduce dependence on manufactured fertilizers, but at the same time it would free up land for a significant expansion in the production of vegetables, legumes and other horticultural crops. Next slide, please, John. So the second core transformation is around smarter, more integrated land use. So we face a land squeeze as greater demands are placed on UK land use, and land needs to move away from being a net source of emissions to a net sink. In European terms, we are we have a relatively low level of woodland and forest cover in the UK. It's around 13-14% at the moment. The carbon budget from the Climate Change Committee talks in terms of that figure increasing to around 19-20% by 2050. In some of our scenarios, to get to a net zero UK, woodland cover would have to increase by significantly more than this, depending on our willingness or unwillingness to accept other types of changes. But CB7 talks about around 1.5 million hectares of UK land changing from agricultural use to woodland and energy crops. That would mean rates of establishing new woodland would need to roughly treble between now and the end of the 2030s. So we need to see quite a steep acceleration in the rate of new tree planting and the expansion of energy crops through to end of the 2030s, start of 2040s. I think there's also we need to see land use moving away from single uses of land to a situation where land is managed for several different purposes. Food production, carbon sequestration, nature restoration need to be delivered together in the same sorts of landscapes and often on the same plots of land. Now, critical for land use change to play its part in the overall transformation of the food system is that paring back of the 85% of agricultural land taken by animal production in one form or another. This would help with the resilience of the land use system, and it would mean better and more efficiently matching the productive capacity of the UK's land resource with the nutritional and public health needs of the UK population. Next slide, please, which is the healthy food one. Third transformation we call healthier diets made easier. So lots can be said about what poor diet is doing for our public finances and national economic performance. Unhealthy eating is currently the default within the food system, and poor diet and poor access to healthy, affordable food is driving deepening social inequalities. Although meat and dairy production will continue to have an important role to play in the system, in this third transformation, we do need to move to a greater diversity of protein sources, which would have the benefit of being less land hungry. So we need to make healthy food more accessible and affordable, and this is likely to require a broad range of measures that extend far beyond the usual calls for just sort of better information and labelling or better education. If change in production and consumption are thought about and managed together, they become part of a national mission that drives economic growth, improves public health, strengthens the resilience of our food system, and could improve national food security. Next slide. So the roadmap has got lots and lots of suggestions for what can be done within those three core transformations. We've pulled out 10 sort of priority actions to sit above all of the others, and they're sometimes quite cross-cutting. I'm going to very quickly run through these just to give you a flavour of some of the things the roadmap suggests. So the first is around the way that we support agriculture in the UK. So we need to review and revisit the farming support schemes across the different countries of the UK. And they probably need to be better aligned with resilience, with climate adaptation, and with reduced emissions. Currently, I mean, they vary in each of the four parts of the UK. In England, where they've probably been, they've moved furthest from what went before. The environmental payments are quite heavily orientated to biodiversity. And we probably need to look at the balance and see how we can reorient support to help support this transition, this transformation, and building resilience. It might also mean a shift from payments to capital grants in some cases as well. Second priority action is around setting targets for dietary change and animal numbers, so that progress in progressing along this pathway can be monitored and more actively managed. We do have that data and have those numbers, but it's not something that is sort of reported on and monitored and thought about in a public and explicit kind of way yet. And we could use things like public procurement system to build new opportunities for growers and suppliers, and to stimulate new markets as well. Third one is around requiring major food businesses to publish food system transition plans with measurable targets. The NHS Fit for the Future plan does contain some welcome steps, but at the moment, the only sort of real financial and regulatory measures are focused on sugar in soft drinks, in the soft drinks industry levy. And that approach probably needs to be broadened along a wider range of higher emitting foodstuffs. Fourth one is about how you manage across government departmental boundaries. And we suggested a National Food System Transformation Committee reporting to the Prime Minister as one suggestion for how you can lift this out of ownership by a single government department and try and get concerted action across agriculture, environment, land, health, and treasury as well. We need more effective food systems data to track the process. We need to think about introducing measures that strengthen food security and align trade policies with domestic food system transformation goals. So currently our trade policy feels a bit detached from our health and our agriculture policy. Seventh one is about taking advantage of all the opportunities to offset emissions and inset within supply chains. There's lots of interesting stuff happening within the food system here, but more can be done. We need to take steps to improve confidence in how these markets work. And we've got quite a proliferation of carbon calculator tools in play at the moment, which make for confusion. And it'd be really good if we could have a British quality standards to help harmonise and set basic standards for data and emissions calculations. The eighth one is on integrated food and land strategies, national and regional levels. Thinking about planning the way that our agriculture evolves and develops alongside all of the environmental targets that we have around supply chain resilience and the land squeeze. We've got a recommendation on measures and tools for building public confidence and consent and hopefully helping to build cross-party consensus around the direction of travel for the transformation as well. And on research, interdisciplinary research ideally would become the norm for research in agriculture and food systems research. Next slide, please, John. And I'm nearly finished. I think this is the last slide before the final one. We've thought about the period to 2050 in terms of three phases. So the first phase is the next 5 years, building the foundations. The 2030s is when solutions get really scaled up and rolled out, and the 2040s then becomes a period of monitoring, review, tweaking, consolidating progress. So there's a real urgency in this transformation, and really this direction of travel has been, what we're proposing is not a radical departure from the Climate Change Committee's report of January 2020 or the National Food Strategy that Henry Dimbleby and his team produced in 2021, was it, I think? So it's not a radical departure from that, but we do need to be making progress at a more rapid rate in the latter half of this decade than we have in the first half of this decade. But we can't just push ahead on all fronts. So what we've tried to do in the roadmap is provide a framework and an architecture, if you like, for sequencing, mindful of the fact that the world is likely to change over this next 25 years. So the first phase is a critical window for establishing the foundations. It focuses on setting a clear direction of travel, establishing a long-term commitment among the key interest groups, government departments, and building consensus. And this requires thinking about what all the advantages are for the different elements of the food system in buying into and committing to a transformational pathway over a 25-year period. And it means creating the conditions for accelerating progress in the 2030s. So it includes measures like establishing the institutional architecture, developing financing mechanisms such as agricultural transition funds, functioning carbon markets, and reforming agricultural subsidies to align with the transformation goals. With the foundations established, the second phase is the decade of most intensive change. 2030s is where we really scale up the solutions. Lots of emphasis on rolling out mainstreaming, extending practices and systems beyond pilots. Success requires moving from incremental adjustments to real structural change. Supporting communities through that change, including retraining programs, diversification, support for regional development funds. We also need to be transforming food environments in the 2030s at scale and with comprehensive reform of retail environments and the public procurement system. Building resilient supply chains, which includes processing facilities and distribution networks for expanding UK horticulture. We think horticulture needs to grow fourfold or fivefold, not just a sort of 20 or 50% increase, but a real step change up. And developing emerging alternative protein sectors. The final phase is a shift in focus from driving change to embedding and optimizing new systems. So by 2040, the food system will look fundamentally different. It will include sustainable practices becoming standard for a new generation of farmers and land managers, while consumers will be expecting and demanding healthy, sustainable food as default. This will require changes in the relationships between food production, land use, and consumption, and they'll have to change further as they mature. It means addressing the remaining high emission sectors through next generation technologies and practices, but also stress testing and managing the transformed food system against extreme weather, shifting growing conditions, and and global supply chain disruptions. So that just gives you a flavour of how the actions and considerations might sort of pan out over that 25-year period. I see that we're on 1538, so I'm going to stop at that point. But I think the next slide frames the question that no, it doesn't, does it, Jez? You're going to put that question.
Yeah.
Everybody.
Yeah, no, brilliant. Thanks, Neil. Tim, if you want to come back on the line, that'd be great as well. Yeah, so thanks both for that. I hope everybody got lots out of that. We've got lots of good questions coming in, but we're going to start with one that we think is a really, really important one. And I've seen a few people posing this in the Q&A, which there's this very big question of, we've had a lot of reports, 10 to 12 of these sort of reports over the last few years, roughly, saying pretty much the same thing in many ways, and our roadmap report brings a lot of that together into one place. But the question is how do we open up the political space to make this happen? Tim, I wonder if you could start us off on this. You spent a lot of time talking to politicians both in the UK and internationally, going to COPs, all sorts of things like that. What's your sort of thoughts at this point?
Yeah, well, if I knew the answer, we would have written a quite different report, I think. The challenge is, as you said, going back 10 years at least, even, the Eat Lancet, IPCC, Henry's report, Climate Change Committee reports, etc., etc. There's a lot of, broadly, we have to change our diets, broadly, we have to change the way we farm, broadly, we have to build adaptation at the same time. Broadly, we have to do more about biodiversity. So the kind of core message that we've come up with is not new. We've supported it in a more integrated way with modelling and thinking about the futures, and we've tried every single combination of parameters to see whether or not you can get to a net zero without, for example, reducing land take from agriculture and livestock numbers, and the answer is no, as everybody has suggested. So that raises the question, as with climate change itself, given we need to act, given we have the information, what is actually holding us back? And my analysis of this that we published recently in a UNEP report is that the system is effectively locked in, and that it becomes very politically, economically, and socially difficult to drive change, because politicians won't do anything very radical because it will become a vote loser in their mind. Industry is not going to change because at the moment it's relatively comfortable with the status quo, and the old kind of trope that, well, we'll change when our customers tell us to change begs a whole lot of questions. And citizens are not kind of really gagging for change at the moment, in the sense that they're not driving it through either consumption decisions, which are difficult to do, or through the political process. So we're left with this kind of paradox that the faster that we need to act, the more difficult it is to act. So one of our senses, one of our recommendations is that we need to open up the political space. And from my perspective, that has to come from us building some form of grassroots consensus that change is necessary and change is coming. We're going to steer the change in the right way. And whether that's through citizen assemblies or citizen movements or whatever, but we've got to do something to allow the policy to start being developed that is radical enough to drive the transformation. And at the moment, there's Nietzsche that said, whoever you vote for, you get the government. The government is effectively got so little space to move, it's not going to transform things unless a crisis hits us. I mean, if Putin presses the wrong button or something like that, and we end up with trade seriously interdicted, then crisis will drive changes in agricultural policy from a health perspective and a food security perspective, which will drive things. But without that sort of crisis, which might well come, it's got to be about politicizing the issue and getting people to say to their MPs, we want you to be more ambitious about change in that perspective. So that's a quick summary from me of where I stand at the end of my career, but Neil might have something to add to that.
Yeah, Neil, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I was just looking at some of the questions as well, and I saw that Dan asked about Dan Crossley asked about what's the biggest sort of surprise or new insight, and I think I can tie those two things together, because I think we started off with a focus on net zero because that's what we were asked by UKRI to look at. But the sort of conceptual and intellectual journey that I think we've been through all of the discussions in the network about, well, actually, you can put the net zero target to one side if you think about tackling the tangle of challenges from the perspective of resilience and food security. It leads you to a similar place that then ticks off the net zero target almost as a side effect of building a more resilient system. And I think that sort of insight that the scale, both geographically and I guess probably in terms of sort of, well, certainly in terms of emissions, but also energy, attention and anxiety, the way that the 85% animal agriculture is dominating the UK scene, but also restricting our scope of movement and flexibility and resilience. I think that was something that the modelling highlighted and rendered really crisply sort of visible to me in a way that I hadn't fully appreciated previously. And that then leads to a discussion about, that can be articulated as quite a sort of patriotic discussion about, the UK in an uncertain world. It's a discussion that we're quite comfortable having about energy. We don't want to be dependent on Putin's, oil and gas or energy. So that's used as a rhetorical device to justify the green energy transition, a whole system transformation in energy. And I think we have to find a language to talk about food in a similar way.
Yeah, and it's got to be something that can withstand different governments. As Tim said, you vote for the government, you get the government, but also, we're looking at the very real possibility of reform in next time, potentially, maybe Conservatives at some point in the future, although it's looking less likely at the moment. But the possibility of a government at the moment is really a set of people that really want to throw any sort of net zero or climate targets out the window. So it's got to be an argument, hasn't it, that withstands across these different political sort of boundaries and like this huge kind of polarization spectrum that we have. Just going back to what Tim was saying about needing almost this grassroots kind of movement. There are some questions in here from people, I think someone called Claire, about the role of devolved governments. So if we think much more about, is change, does it feel like too intractable at a national scale? But if it's brought down to more of a devolved government, slightly smaller, or even city level, does that start to look more possible? I was at the Eat Forum in Stockholm a couple of weeks ago, and we saw some incredible examples of cities really able to enact change because it feels just less complicated, I suppose. Tim, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, and it's implicit in the roadmap report that you need that kind of polycentric governance in a way, and bringing food down to local communities is part and parcel of that. And whether it's Tim Lang thinking about the local resilience forums and the resilience from a food security perspective and a government perspective, or is it if it's my nearest town is Bradford, and they've got quite an ambition around their local food system. The challenge with all of that, of course, is that local food systems are subject to trade at a UK level. That, if you want to source food locally produced, you risk being undercut in many ways by cheaper food with greater externalities being imported. And so that's why the part of the structural change has got to be getting the market incentives right, so that farmers farming in a way that is more consistent with meeting the challenges aren't under pressure financially and their livelihoods aren't threatened financially, but they're doing the right things and should get rewarded. So in that UNEP report I mentioned earlier, we talk about inverting the business model. At the moment, it is more profitable to grow stuff that ends up in unhealthy and unsustainable food. We need to make it more profitable to grow stuff that ends up in healthy and sustainable food, and that's not the case at the moment. So market incentives, market drivers, subsidies, and other ways of making that better will need to be put in place from a local level to a national level to a UK level, and wider, of course.
I think there's a question around what you're kind of talking about, a sort of a just transition as well, which is undoubtedly part of this whole, how this is communicated, and there's and how it's enacted. There's a question here which relates to that, which is what do you see as the most at risk from the suggested changes, i.e. who would be the sort of the losers in quotes, and how do we bring those people along on the journey and ensure they're not left behind? Does the report include safety net proposals, etc.? So I think that, I suppose there's a question there, isn't there, about, again, it's about how this change is sort of presented, how, I suppose, at a kind of more grassroots level it's thought through, so that the sort of the losers, as it were, are not disadvantaged too much.
Yeah, I'll pass on to Neil after a brief comment. The question is, who are the losers? I mean, obviously, a intensive livestock farmer who might feel threatened by us saying we need to reduce the size of the livestock herd in the UK feels threatened. But equally, many, particularly of the young generation, feel threatened from climate anxiety. The poorest people have access to the worst diets and live the shortest time and have the greatest burden of illness. So the challenge will be, and there isn't a simple answer to this, the challenge will be getting the market to work in the way that people can feed themselves healthily and farmers can produce sustainably and people make the profits doing the right thing, rather than only making the profits by doing something that might be at the moment in the national interest from an economic growth perspective, but in the long run is just storing up more and more problems for the future. Neil.
Yeah, I guess we've got a pattern of winners and losers at the moment, and the world is going to change a lot, and so the question of winners and losers in the transition has to be set against the trajectories that are already in play and where we would end up if we did nothing. We think that there will be an increasing number of losers, including just the general national economic well-being from doing nothing. But the roadmap sets out a set of cross-cutting principles. There are two things that the three transformations have to be handled together, but then there have to be some considerations that apply through the 25-year transition, and one of those is about sort of social inequality and a just transition, and that there has to be that sort of stock take, all through the 25 years to keep an eye on that, to be managing it. I mean, there is experience across Europe, including in the UK, of managing structural change in the agricultural industry. I mean, if you look at the changes that were experienced in places like Portugal and Greece and Spain through entry into the Common Agricultural Policy, or in the new Eastern European member states, there were huge structural programs put in place to support that transition and to build new economies and to upskill, and amalgamations and technological change and so on. So, it's not beyond our wits to design programs to manage change, to mitigate against consequences that we might choose to ease. So that's doable. It just takes political will. I was going to just make a point about the England, Scotland, Wales thing as well, which is not quite the same as sort of local and bottom up, but we've already got quite a distinctive pattern of political concerns around this agenda in the four different parts of the UK, and in terms of the way that land use will change, that's likely to be very different in the four parts of the UK. So it is quite interesting. This is not a sort of uniform UK agenda and set of prescriptions. It has to be sensitive to regional and the devolved concerns and agendas.
Yeah.
Can I just come back in on Rosemary's question about taking food out of the commodity markets, because I think that's a kind of a key question. We need markets. We absolutely you can't produce and distribute and consume without having access to markets. The trouble has been that under the neoliberal era, the way that governments think about market is to deregulate as much as possible. And what I guess we're really calling for is to put not more regulation, but different regulation in the markets so that the incentives are in the right place to reward the behavior that we need as a society as a whole. So that's not destroying markets, that is effectively building public goods into the market. So at the moment, too much private good is there, the rich are getting richer, industry is getting more consolidated, more powerful, and more difficult to force or argue to change. And somehow that's got to be changed if we're going to ever get to the point where we have a food system or an economic system that is better for people and the planet. At the moment, we're just heading in the wrong direction. And as I say, you know, if we don't do something, eventually the market will have to change because it'll be driven to change. And it's building the political will to drive the change in the right places and put the incentives in the right places and the disincentives in the right places to make our markets work, because we have large-scale market failure at the moment.
There's a question here that relates directly to that term, which is, does government's emphasis on economic growth mitigate against the right actions being taken? Is
Absolutely.
growth the right focus? Yeah.
No, no, I mean, it's funny. I'm examining a PhD in Belgium next week, which tackles this question. And the conclusion from that and from my own thinking is that too narrow a focus privileging economic growth in the long run just makes no sense. In the short run, it does make sense because everybody wants to be richer, and the conflation of economic growth with me getting richer is what is the sleight of hand in this space. If the UK has a growing economy, not everybody gets richer, because that money, as is well known, gets more and more kind of ring-fenced around a smaller number of very, very wealthy individuals. So we need, you know, overall getting away from GDP as a sole measure of our national well-being into a much more of a well-being economy where GDP and individual livelihoods and wealth prosperity are just part of the overall package.
With that in mind, there are quite a lot of questions now about food companies, multinationals, retailers, processors, etc., asking how they fit into all of this, how they fit into the roadmap. Neil, do you want to take that one?
Well, the forward to the Henry Dimbleby report said he said he'd talked to lots of chief execs, and that they're not averse to regulation as long as it's a level playing field. So we take them at their word on that, and I think that the sugary drinks, the soft drinks industry levy has been quite successful in terms of changing the formulation of products. So I think it would pay dividends to look at the ways in which that could be rolled out much more widely to incentivize the development, promotion and marketing of healthier foods, and to disincentivize the more highly processed and higher emitting and unhealthy foods. Those sort of characteristics. You can have highly processed but quite healthy foods, so we've got to be careful about our categories here. But there's a model there that seems to have worked quite well. So I think we should be looking at that and trying to roll it out further. But it's certainly, the environment in which people access and buy food is really shaping, what's getting bought and what's getting eaten. And so we do have to look at that food environment and I think intervene to change it. And that's going to require that the companies change. But if the rules are common across all of them, there shouldn't be a great problem because it's a very, very competitive sector and they compete, very, very competitive with each other, but they can do that on changed rules.
Just going back a moment to growth, economic growth, it was obviously tied to companies a lot. There's a question here from someone called Henry Goeg. Is the way to open up political space to highlight the problem of the reduced workforce due to diet-related ill health and therefore the impact on growth and productivity? Is that one way to do it? And I suppose that also opens up the question, which is just that if economic growth is the wrong thing to be driving at, but we know that the government and it feels like every government is always going to be having that as a driving force. We've got this issue, haven't we, of needing to couch whatever we say and do potentially in that language, in that of economic growth, in order to get through politically. But if it's the wrong, I don't know, is that the right thing or not?
Well, I think of this in two ways. One is that we can argue from an evidence-based perspective and from a logical and moral and ethical perspective that we need to move to a well-being economy. So we can argue for a change in the kind of the rules of the political rules of the game. But equally, post-Ukraine, post-COVID, the issue of national security has come up the agenda. And if you look at what is a good food system from a national security perspective, it's a different answer, a different vision to what is a good food system from a pure economic growth perspective. So in a world at war, say, where the globalization agenda has backtracked and we're into a more regional EU or localized agenda, then the issue of corporate power in a sense gets dealt with because we won't have a food system under the kind of business as usual rules of the game, because what is a multinational corporation if you're not globalized? And so some of the power issues might be forced to go away if trade becomes more fragile than it is at the moment, because we will have to think much more constructively about growing what we need to grow from a health and nutrition and food security perspective. And that government will then change the incentives and change the drivers and encourage more horticulture and all the rest of that under those circumstances. So the economic growth imperative is something of the politics of today, and it might not be the politics of 5 or 10 years' time. So it might change from within, from us arguing for change as a citizenry, or it might change externally because of the way that the world and markets drivers are going to change.
Interesting. It's 4 o'clock. We did say, I think, that if there were lots of questions, we could go on a bit. Are you both free to do that? Do you want to do that? There's 40 questions. We won't get through all of them. But I can fire some at you. We can kind of try and go through some as quickly as possible, maybe. What do you think?
Yeah, another 10 minutes is fine.
Yeah, another 10 minutes. Okay. So someone was asking about universal basic income. Is that, and other people have asked about, safety nets, that kind of thing. Where is the roadmap on that, and what do we think?
Well, I don't think we're particularly explicit about that, because the way that you would do that depends on whether you're in a trade interdicted situation or a globalized situation, etc. But it's very true from what Neil said earlier. A cross-cutting thread is we need a just transition. And if food prices and food availability is going to change, we need to ensure that poverty is not related to food poverty and ill health through diets. And how you would do that, as I say, depends on whether it's a UBI, universal basic income, whether it's more food prescribing, whether it is changing the food environments, or however it might work out. That's a necessary part. But one of the reasons that a healthy diet is prohibitively expensive at the moment is that we concentrate too much on growing commodities that end up as the base of the ultra-processed food, the major commodities. So those are cheap, they're easily shipped, they're global supply chains, etc. And we don't grow enough fruit and vegetables and the sorts of things that people need for a healthy life. So they're more expensive. And by growing more and incentivizing that, availability and price in itself will change. And, again, that illustrates in a sense the trickiness of the situation, because the unhealthiness of the diet is associated with global supply chains and major commodity crops. And to change that, we have to tackle trade and production in the UK and food environments and processing and et cetera, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. Neil, one for you. Someone called Nathan is asking about the 10 recommendations. Do we have a picture of progress against these priority actions? I know somebody else had asked whether the other 10 priority actions, are they in order of sort of importance, or is that not random?
They're not random, but they're pulled out from all of the things that are talked about in the report as, I guess they tend to be elevated because they're a bit more cross-cutting and they give a flavour of the, you can't really talk through sort of 70 recommendations. So they're, in that sense, they're a bit more evocative, and so I guess they're a bit more important. But within the 10, I don't think we very, very carefully agonised over whether that should be ranked 6th or 7th. So I wouldn't take the order, I wouldn't read too much into the ordering of those 10.
Mm-hmm. Someone else asking about the priority actions. Is regulation anywhere in there? And also someone else has asked about food policy. They seem to think from the priority actions that we weren't talking about food policy and the need for a food policy, but I think we are, aren't we? If you want to take that a bit more now.
Yeah, and I think the work, the food companies and the food environment is principally about regulation. I mean, you can work with the companies and work in partnership, and you can have potentially voluntary schemes, but I think ultimately it would probably be regulation would be the most crisp and efficient way to transform the food environment, particularly when it comes to the 2030s. So there's a few years of planning that and talking about it and thinking it through, but the degree of change that we need to see in the 2030s, I think, would require a level of regulation of what food manufacturers and retailers do. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Roberto, I'm not sure if Roberto works for DEFRA or not, but Roberto is asking, what is the one thing the government or DEFRA could start doing differently today to move away from the status quo and get close to the transformation needed?
Well, for me, it is getting real about the need for transformation. So if you think back to the Climate Change Act and all the rest of that, that was preceded by a whole lot of information, campaigning, discussion of if we don't deal with this, the problems will mount up. And at the moment, there isn't a far-sighted, long-distance conversation. DEFRA at the moment is quite wary about talking about food and nutrition at the same time as farming and agriculture and trade. And so for me, it's really about, and this is part of the reason for the phase 1 consolidation, is to create leadership in the space. And in a Chatham House report from 7 or 8 years ago, we did focus groups around the world, and that was broadly about this same topic. And what we got from lots and lots of different countries was, if government is not saying change will have to happen, it's not today, it's going to be in 3 years' time or 5 years' time or 10 years' time, then people are licensed to ignore that. They feel that, if it's important, government will be telling them that change is necessary. So I understand the politics of the space at the moment and how difficult it is for DEFRA to do anything concrete. But DEFRA should be, or government in general, should be saying, we can't tackle biodiversity, emissions, pollution, climate adaptation, climate mitigation without some radical change in the way that our markets and the regulatory structure and the way that markets work. And we will have to change. And, the worst thing in this space for me was Joe Biden saying 5 years ago, we can tackle climate change and no one needs to worry about changing their lifetime and changing their habits. That's just not true. We have to move to a place where the opportunities for us being better off in the round as a society and as individuals is greater, but we need to really face up to the fact that we've got to do a journey to get there. And if we don't do that journey, then things will get worse over the decades ahead.
What made the Climate Change Act possible in a way that is sort of not happening today with food?
Well, it was a different world back in those days, 15 years plus ago. We had a cross-party consensus. We had a stable world. We had, the kind of thought that Berlin Wall had come down. We're in a world of peace and stability, and it's all about us being cooperative and rules-based order, etc. So it was a kind of warm, fuzzy feeling that we could be in this together. And contrast that with the polarized and volatile politics of today, that's going to be much more difficult to get. But unless we deal with it, the longer we leave off making progress in this transformation, the more painful it will be in the long run.
Last question, it was from Dan Crossley as well, was what makes you optimistic? I'm hoping there was a little something in there. What gives you hope that we can do this and it will happen?
Neil, I'll leave you to answer that first.
Well, I really enjoy going to Groundswell and seeing those couples walking around Groundswell, and it's usually a male farmer in their 50s or 60s with their son or daughter, and in ever increasing numbers you see that appetite for sort of facing a challenge and finding new opportunities in the changing world. I mean, the number of people going to Groundswell is going up and up and up each year, and you can see sort of generational change in agricultural practice and ideology as well, I think. So that's where I go to get a positive vibe.
Come on, Tim, one thing, got to find some hope there.
No, I have a lot of hope. I mean,
Oh, good.
This is not outside our ability to tackle these challenges, just like climate change is not outside our ability, but the politics is tricky. So for me, it is ultimately, when push comes to shove, within your community of humans, people tend to be nice to each other at a kind of community level, and that kind of breaks down as you get bigger and bigger and bigger distances between us and other people. So fundamentally, people are nice, and we know what to do and we know how to do it. And particularly people of your age, Jez, and much more switched on. Neil and my generation, we kind of ducked out of a lot of the political issues in the years past, in the decades past, and we shouldn't have done in the chase for kind of the Thatcherite economic growth and prosperity. And I think it does come down to the world waking up and people waking up and saying, we want change, because it's not difficult change. I mean, it will be tricky change as we go through it, but it's not difficult to plan the change at the pace we need. And we know what to do, and we'll be so much better off if we grasp it.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. I also feel actually optimistic, being a bit younger and people much younger than me working on this now as well. And yeah, I actually feel really optimistic in that sense, and seeing that people all around the world are grappling with this in different ways, and there's a lot of shared knowledge there, I think, as well. So anyway, thank you, Tim and Neil. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. We've had 45 questions, plus lots of comments. So sorry if we've not got to them. But yeah, thank you also very much for your contributions, including into the roadmap if you had a part in that. We've recorded this obviously, so if you want to play it back, we'll be putting out a video next week. With that, we'll email it out to you. Better still, go and read the roadmap on our website. John will be sharing links in the chat again. It's on the homepage of our website already. You can see the main report, the summary, the press release if you're interested in the sort of angle that we took, plus digests of like the key points and those 3 core transformations. This is also my last time chairing an AFN webinar. and in fact the 34th one that we've done. So if you're on this, you're one of 10,000 people that's either watched one of our webinars or like in person or watch them back online later. So big thank you to everyone who's kind of kept coming, kept supporting these, sharing insights, prodding us with questions, and sort of coming with a lot of curiosity. You know, it's invaluable, and it's why we do them. So there is going to be an AFN webinar as usual in November and also in December, we're hoping. So look out for an email about these. That won't be coming from me anymore, but it will be coming from the team. So look out for those, and the hope is to continue them next year as well. So if you've got 3 minutes, we would really love you to just use the link that John is sharing to rate this webinar, because all of it kind of goes into sort of our evidence base for looking for more funding. So that would be great. But yeah, thanks Tim, thanks Neil, thanks John.
Thanks, Jez.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, Jez.
All right.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.